minds have a choice of ages to watch this play. So when it's time to make your decision too, remember who it is you're fighting for, it's you. No one can tell you how you should feel inside. What's right and wrong is a choice you make up in your own mind. Think you should hurry while you have time, no matter what the case may be.
All right, thanks for joining me. It's August 19th, and I'm sitting here in my office, been working all day, and I really wanted to get back to these coronavirus issues that I didn't get to talk about last time because I was too busy talking about guns. Have a live audience this time. I've got my brother Trey and his girlfriend Deanna here with me from New Orleans. I've also got Helga the dog, the German Shepherd guard dog, hanging out here. And let me turn this banner off. If you have any questions, let me know, and hopefully I'll see them. In fact, before I start, Janine says, in today's COVID briefing, Justice again said he may impose travel restrictions in the future, that he's just putting a hold on those restrictions for now. If you haven't read what I had prepared or what I had written and put on my blog site at thecivilrightslawyer.com on the travel restrictions or the proposed travel restrictions that he brought up, go check it out, because I immediately jumped on that when I heard him say it the first time. And as you'll see if you read that, that's what the governor of Kentucky tried, and he's way worse than our governor. And, with many of these COVID restrictions, and he tried to implement a travel ban. The problem with that is that the governors have a lot of power within their own state. But once they start restricting the travel of people between states, then they implicate the federal constitution in a big way. And that violates the Privileges and Immunities Clause, where, a citizen of West Virginia is supposed to be able to travel through Virginia or through Kentucky without that state, blocking their travel. And that's where he'll really get into trouble if he tries that. But the whole point here is, this was back on March 16th of 2020 that Jim Justice declared a state of emergency in West Virginia under our emergency powers statute, and that's 1556. And in that executive order, he provided he provided that basically the entire state of West Virginia was a disaster zone because of the COVID-19 epidemic. And really, the interesting thing about it, when I even look back at it today, is that nowhere in his executive order did he mention any power for him to do this under the state constitution. The only thing that he cited was the West Virginia Code 1552, which is the basic emergency powers statute here in West Virginia. And that also doesn't mention the state constitution. And if you've researched state constitutional law, in particular, the separation of powers doctrine, then you would know that the West Virginia legislature cannot give their legitimate responsibilities, their powers, away to the governor. So even if they wanted to give the governor the ability to rule as a dictator during any time he believes is a state of emergency, they can't do that. So in the end, we always have to go back to the state constitution, which is never suspended, even in a time of war, pursuant to its own words. So at no time can the governor suspend the state constitution, period. So all he's pointed to in his executive orders is this West Virginia Code statute, 1552. And that says that he can take control over certain disaster areas, that he can control people coming and going from that disaster area, that he can control the occupancy of buildings within that disaster area. And obviously that implies, or that is supposed to apply in situations where a town is flooded, for instance, or there's wildfires in the area and he needs to cut off traffic going into a certain area, or or an earthquake or some sort of disaster as the word was written. But what you have here is he just declares the entire state a disaster area because there's this impending doom of a virus pandemic. But the problem is that was on March 16th of 2020. Now it's been 5 months and a few days. Right now, August 19th. 5 months since this state of emergency declaration. And it's been applied for these 5 months in all 55 states in West Virginia. So every county in the state of West Virginia has been under rule by executive fiat during this entire time. In other words, rule by one man without any elected representation by what's supposed to be the voice of the people, and that's the state legislature, the House of Delegates, the West Virginia Senate. So it's been 5 months, and there seems to be no end in sight to this state of emergency style of government. It's not just our state, it's other states. So nowhere in the governor's proclamation that we're to be living under a state of emergency style government does he mention any constitutional power for him to do this. And if you read the Constitution, and I'll put the link up to it on the blog site, thecivilrightslawyer.com, but you can Google West Virginia Constitution and read it. It's not very long. If you read our Constitution, nowhere in there will you see the phrase state of emergency. Nowhere in there did our state founding fathers put, Article 5, state of emergency situations. They didn't do that. It's nowhere in the Constitution, and the Constitution can never be suspended, not even in a time of war. So this is purely a government under statute that we're in. And if you look at the governor's executive orders, he mentions the first paragraph will say, whereas West Virginia Code 1552 gives the governor emergency powers, and whereas those powers allow him to control ingress and egress from disaster areas, and whereas, and then he'll state the reasons why he thinks it's a state of emergency. And in the very first one, you see that he talked about President Trump declaring a national emergency, and about the World Health Organization declaring a national emergency, and that COVID-19 was this worldwide pandemic that had never been faced before. But nowhere in there did you see anything about any authority to do this under the state constitution. And this is unprecedented. It's never happened before, even though we've actually had pandemics before since our state constitution was ratified in the 1870s. And it was 1918 that we had a worse pandemic, and that was the Spanish flu, is what they ended up calling it. And they didn't call it the Spanish flu at the time. I don't recall what they called it, but they didn't know where it came from at first. But eventually they realized they thought it came from Spain, so they called it the Spanish flu. But it was much more disastrous, not only worldwide or in our country or in West Virginia. And it wasn't a majority of people over age 55 or with health problems who were dying during the Spanish flu. You had entire military bases full of young military age guys who were healthy enough to be, serving active duty at that time, who were literally dropping dead, and they were running out of coffins, and they had bodies piled up. So, I mean, that was, by all accounts, much worse than anything we've seen so far with COVID-19. And that was in 1918. And the West Virginia Emergency Powers Statute was written much after that. But nowhere in there did the legislature say that if there is a worldwide pandemic again, that the governor can take over and enact his own laws and suspend any other laws that he wants to do. In other words, act in the place of a legislature. I mean, there was that language was not included in there. So what he's done is to run with the language that he was given, and that was basically the ability to respond to flood type situations or wildfire situations. And we act like, well, this is unprecedented. It's never happened before, and that's not true. Our forefathers had been faced with terrible pandemics, terrible epidemics, terrible diseases in the past, and they never designed our system in such a way, either the state or nationally, that if a pandemic hits or an awful sickness hits, that all of a sudden our system of government changes from what our founding fathers wanted it to be, which is a tricameral form of Republican democratic government, a representative government. But now it's going to be a rule by one person. So the legal basis for these orders is presumed by everybody, but it's not there, in my opinion. So it's been 5 months living under the executive rule of one person who gets to decide, what businesses will close, what businesses get to stay open, and then what businesses get to open with restrictions. And that's just the start of it. Enacting a so-called mask mandate. Making people wear masks in a building, making business owners have to deal with that, and closing businesses, even arresting people. All this has been done by one person, one governor. Now, obviously, there have been other people behind the scenes, but we don't necessarily know who they are. If you recall, just a few days ago, the governor of West Virginia met with the Vice President Mike Pence at his resort, the governor's resort, the Greenbrier. And if you look at the governor's press release, it talks about all the people who were invited and took part in this joint discussion on West Virginia's response to the coronavirus. I believe that there were U.S. senators, U.S. congressmen, the adjutant general. I mean, you had federal officials there. You had some state executive officials there. But you know who wasn't there and who hasn't been there or involved in this process the entire time? And that's the West Virginia legislature. And that's the voice of the people. That's our only representation. And they weren't involved in it. They weren't invited to it. Certainly, the Greenbrier Resort is large enough to house the West Virginia legislature for a few hours or one day, but they weren't a part of it. So, and that illustrates exactly what's happened. We've been told it was just 14 days or 13 days to flatten the curve. This was just an emergency thing, and it would just have to happen for, we'd have to just take emergency precautions, and then, things would get back to normal. But here we are over 5 months later. And if anything, really, it's gotten worse. And at this point now, we have the so-called mask mandate. If you look at West Virginia's DHHR website, they have these, I don't know if it's daily, but certainly every once in a while, they have these West Virginia COVID updates. And I was looking at the one yesterday. And they had noted on their website there that as of 10 a.m. on August 17th, there had been 360,669 total lab tests received for COVID-19 in West Virginia, with 8,632 total cases and 160 deaths so far. Now, out of those, so 360,000 something people tested. Out of those, 8,600 positive cases, and then we only had 160 deaths out of that over 5 months. And out of that 8,600, there's some number of cases that have recovered, and that's the majority of them. I believe maybe it's like 7,000 or almost 7,000 people have recovered in West Virginia. And under those numbers, they had this little small print that caught my eye. It said, as case surveillance continues at the local health department level, it may reveal that those tested in a certain county may not be a resident of that county or even the state, as an individual in question may have crossed the state border to be tested. Such is the case of Fayette, Harrison, Randolph, and Upshur counties in this report. So, that's an interesting disclaimer to put in there. And why don't we hear more about that? I can recall where my county, Monroe County, they at one point decreased the number on the state's dashboard of how many active cases there were, because apparently people were coming in out of state into West Virginia to get the free COVID testing. So there were people coming in from out of state or even from other counties to get tested over here. So that's always, that's something that should be looked at. And who better to look at it than, the people that we send to Charleston, West Virginia to represent us. And they're the only ones that are not at the table at all. And thank you, Cynthia. That's exactly right. He who gives us freedom for safety gets none of them. And that's exactly what's happening right now. Is I believe that there has been, and well, it's not that I believe, there has been I don't want to call it a conspiracy, but there has been an effort to scare the people. There just has. It's an effort to instill fear in the population. Why? Why do they want to instill fear? Because once they make people scared, then those people are willing to give up certain things. They're willing to pay a price, pay a premium in their liberty, in their freedom, in exchange for some measure of perceived safety. And who are they paying that liberty premium to but the government? And why does the government want to get paid in your liberty? Because that's what governments do. They want more power. That's why our system was set up with checks and balances with different branches of government, because government and politicians will always want more power, not less. They will never voluntarily downsize their government. So that's what they're doing, is they're scaring people. And in exchange, they're getting what they want, which is more power. And here we have a governor here in West Virginia who's absolutely drunk on power. I mean, I can't watch his daily press briefings, but if you watch it, he acts like he's a king talking to his peasants, to his people, and tells us that, how much he loves us and he wants to protect us and every last one of us and so on. And that reminds me of, well, who does it remind me of? It reminds me of King Henry VIII. Just trying to protect his people. Little respect for our system of government as it was designed by our ingenious founding fathers. But, does it even bring us any safety? I was looking at some, and if you argue with anybody about this, especially the government, what do you get in return? Well, you don't believe in science. I believe in science. I trust the public health experts. I believe in science. Well, there's science to support both sides of this, depending on where you go. So let's look at some of the science about masks. There is science out there that says that masks don't work. I'll put a link to it on the civilrightslawyer.com after I end. But here's one particular study that I can cite that shows, or numerous studies that show that there are many unknowns and many potential harms that arise from any broad policy requiring people to wear masks. And there's lots of questions that many scientists are looking at that they're not even allowed to look at this point in public. But these are the questions. Do used and loaded masks become sources of enhanced transmission for wearers and others? Do masks become collectors and retainers of pathogens that the mask wearer would otherwise avoid when breathing without a mask? Are large droplets captured by a mask atomized or aerialized into breathable components? Can virions or escape in evaporating droplets stuck to a mask fiber? What are the dangers of bacterial growth on a used and loaded mask? How do pathogen-laden droplets interact with environmental dust and aerosols captured on the mask? What are the long-term health effects on people such as headaches arising from impeded breathing? What about social consequences? Are there negative social consequences to a masked society? Are there negative psychological consequences to a mask as fear-based behavioral modification? What are the environmental consequences of mask manufacturing and disposal? Do the masks shed fibers or substances that are harmful when inhaled? So there's a lot of questions that the scientists have that cautions them to against any broad policy of requiring all of society to all of a sudden go from not wearing a mask in their daily life to now wearing a mask when there's a lack actually of science. There's another study just on going back to the fear aspect of this on COVID-19, which was conducted from an economic standpoint. And I'll also put a link to that up. And that was done by Franklin, Templeton, and Gallup. So the Franklin, Templeton, and Gallup research project. That was by Dr. Sonal Desai, PhD. And this is really a shocking study. So this is polling data, essentially. This is polling data, and I'll put some of it up. And I'll put a link to the actual research on the website, but they found that there is a huge level of misunderstanding by the public of the actual risk that they have from COVID-19, especially as it pertains to their age. And they list the reasons why they think that is and the problems with that. Because everything is always a trade-off between fear and safety and liberty. So number one, Americans still misperceive the risks of death from COVID-19 for different age groups to a shocking extent. Number two, the misperception is greater for those who identify as Democrats, and for those who rely more on social media for information, partisanship, and misinformation. And to misquote Thomas Dolby, they're blinding us from science. And number three, we find a sizable safety premium that could become a significant driver of inflation as the recovery gets underway. So again, this is a study from an investment standpoint. Yeah. Trey, thanks. I'll put Trey's comment up, and he's actually sitting right here next to me. But you're right. Doctors and science also lied about cigarettes. That's exactly correct. And I've talked about that before. We can't just take what doctors tell us to be the truth, because some studies say and some science says that they kill 1/3 of all Americans who die. So a lot of people die due to mistakes made by doctors. A lot of people, no doubt, have died due to the greed of pharmaceutical companies and the medical industry as a whole. And now all of a sudden you can't even criticize them. But with this research, from an economic investment standpoint, where these people are advising their clients on financial risks going forward, they see a big problem here because Americans apparently misperceive how big of a threat COVID-19 really is, especially as to age groups. And therefore, that they're willing to pay a safety premium, to trade safety in exchange for, to trade their freedoms or pay a higher price, even with money, in exchange for a perceived level of safety. And not only that, they find that this is skewed along party lines, with Democrats being among the worst to see a larger threat than actually exists. And they explain what the reason is for that, and especially young people, due to social media. So the results are nothing short of stunning. The mortality data has shown from the very beginning that COVID-19 virus discriminates by age. So older people are overwhelmingly suffering more of the death. And that really can't be disputed. That's straight up facts. Nearly all of the deaths in the United States have been among people older than 55. Nearly all fatalities have been older than 55. But despite that uncontrovertible fact, a large number of Americans, especially young Democrats, are still convinced that the risk to those younger than 55, such as kids going to school, is almost the same level of risk as those who are older. It's just not true. The science is exactly the opposite. So the question is, why do they believe that? And let's look at figure number 1. So this is the deaths by age in the green column. So you can see age 55 or older all the way on the right, and they have the majority of the deaths due to COVID-19. And age 65 and older, it's 80 up there at 80%. And then it drops off really steeply to age 55 to 64 to 12.2%. And it goes really, really down. As you get down to 35 to 44 years old, it's down around 1.9%. So that is the actual data, the actual fatalities that were reported, and some say overreported. Now, the blue column is their belief. The belief, according to the respondents in these polls, those are the people who are convinced that the risk is the same to them as the older ones. So this shows that the degree of fear for one's health is, that they believe exists is, far exceeds the actual risk. So, the share of people who are very worried or somewhat worried of suffering serious health consequences should they get COVID-19 is almost identical across all age brackets between 25 and 64 years old. And the actual data shows that the younger folks, it's way down there, very, very unlikely. And, the share among people aged 18 to 24, for instance, the share of those worried about serious health consequences is 400 times higher than the share of total COVID deaths. And for those 25 to 34, it's 90 times higher. So the chart is truly worth 1,000 words. And as the study indicates, or as they opine, they believe that this is due to the fact that we're in an election year. And let's look at chart 2 here. So these are the share of respondents worried for serious health effects from coronavirus compared to the deaths reported. So the green, you have the share of total deaths. Again, 80% of the total deaths are age 65 and older. Then there's a big drop off. Age 55 to 64, only 12.2. 45 to 54, only 5.0. And then it's just almost statistically irrelevant as you get down to ages 35 through 44, and it almost nothing for children. Yet we're being treated, or the society is being indoctrinated or propagandized to the fact that these people 18 to 24 or 25 to 34, when you see the green bars in the real numbers, they're being scared into the idea that they're just as much at risk as the others. That's how they feel according to the polling data. And that makes sense. But the numbers, it's misinformation. There is actually very little risk to them according to the numbers. And they found that this fear tends to skew along party lines. And they state that they tie the risk to the issue of whether the Trump administration is handling this crisis well or not handling it well. So people who tie to that political argument, they're going to tend to think that they're going to take the position that the risk is greater than it actually is. So Democrats have a political reason to overestimate the risk, to give misinformation regarding the risk, because therefore the people who receive that information are going to be more likely to think that Donald Trump's doing a bad job, that the administration's doing a bad job in responding to COVID-19. So there's been a lot of politics involved, and this polling data shows that the Democrats across the board in their polling responses have overestimated the risk of dying from COVID-19, especially by age. So how information is presented plays a role. Data can be portrayed in different ways, especially using graphs. And we've seen how Governor Justice has done this in West Virginia. And I'll put up slide number 3 here. So this demonstrates, this is not from West Virginia, but this demonstrates how the government or the media can misinform people just by using graphs. People like graphs, but graphs that tend to make it look worse than it really is. So on the top there, you have a graph kind of like the governors are using. And if you look at West Virginia's COVID dashboard, you'll see some graphs like that. And they'll take like Kentucky or Ohio or something like that, and they'll show how West Virginia compares to that. And it doesn't really give you, it doesn't make it look all that that good to you. It gives you really very little information. Now look at the graph below, because the fact is that the large majority of numbers in West Virginia, or not West Virginia, but nationally, are coming from just a couple places, and the big one's New York. So they're comparing. Let's compare Florida to New York. So the blue line at the bottom shows the death rate per population, daily average over 7-day period, with Florida below, and it compares it with New York with a graph above. So look how much better the people in Florida would feel about how they're faring with COVID-19 and what they have to fear or don't have to fear based on that graph. But that is information that people, it's accurate information that people can understand, but that's not the information that they're presented when there's a political objective at causing fear. It's somewhat that way in West Virginia. You'll see that they use graphs with all this COVID dashboard stuff, and the governor puts up graphs, but it won't mention that here in Monroe County there's been 0 deaths, or next door in Summers County there's been 0 deaths and only a couple cases, or that there's been there's all these counties with after 5 months have just a handful of cases and they've all recovered. There's been no death. but we'll get, just a couple of counties that have had problems: Kanawha County, Jackson County, Mercer County, and those will skew the numbers. But we just get the graph, and it looks like it's worse than it really is. So the way that the information is presented is one of the issues. Hey Jim, what do you say? Water heads like pictures. I've never heard that term before. Must be a Florida thing. Jim and I used to hang out back when I was in high school. I don't remember hearing that term waterhead. But hopefully I won't get in trouble for saying that. That's not a racist word. But yeah, they like pictures. People like pictures. And misplaced hillbilly, you're right. It's always something. A new virus will be here in the fall. They'll never allow freedom again without their mask and vaccination card. Nazis would be proud. That's exactly right. And another thing, are you not tired of hearing about Nazis this, Nazis that? Well, what these idiots don't realize is that, they like to talk about fascism, but who were Nazis? Who were Nazis? What was it? The National Association of Socialist Party or something like that? The word socialist is the S in it, which I guess is a Z in German. But so the Nazis were socialists, and who were the communists? And the communist. What's the USSR stand for? United something Socialist Party, right? It was so the Nazi Party was a socialist party. The Communist Party, the USSR, was a socialist party. And then, I've heard it explained that, no, they're actually, one's on the right, one's on the left. No, that's not true. That's not true. They're both just socialist. That's it. The only difference between them has to do with what they want to control, what they want to take over. That's why the socialists and the so-called communists were enemies. Russia and Germany were enemies. It had to do with disputes over power, because every good socialist want to be in charge. They don't want the guy ruling the country next door to be in charge. They want to be in charge. Did you figure out what it was?
Union of Soviet Socialist Russia.
The Union of Soviet Socialist of Russia. So yes, I was right. The communists were socialists. I'm talking to Deanna here, and she's somebody who was born under communist rule. And I don't know if you can hear or pick up her accent or not, but she was born in Romania under communist rule. So that's why I was asking her that. But we were talking the other day about how things have changed in this country. And, I wanted to ask her a few questions of what it was like for her family actually living under communism, under socialism. And it is pretty interesting. But I don't know that it's all that different than kind of what we're starting to see now, where, you had to stand in line to get bread. You had to do what the government told you. And we get called, people, the people promoting socialism in this country are claim to be fighting the fascist. Well, fascism was nothing but socialism, and it was essentially the same thing as what was occurring in Soviet Russia. And as far as what it was like living there, do you mind answering a couple questions?
No, yeah, I can. I don't know if
Here, maybe pull the chair a little bit.
Should I go here? I don't have to fan the camera.
Yeah, there she is. So Deanna, just briefly, where were you born? Where was your family from?
I was born in Romania in '86, so I only basically lived through communism for 3 years, but it was a big part of, I guess, growing up there because I think my parents made the decision to send me to grow up with my grandma because she was in this part of the country in Transylvania where it was a little bit less, I guess, communist, so to say. Like she was able to have her own garden and like livestock and stuff like that. In the city, like my parents were working, but you would have to wait in line to like kind of get bread, like you said, or like meat. I think you would get meat only once a month, and it was rationed to like 1 pound per family, depending on like how big your family was.
And this is in the city or in the country?
That was in the city, but even in the country, like most people were working for the collective, so they got a part of, like, basically that meant they were working the land that was not theirs, it was the state's, and then each of them would get like a minor piece of like the crops. Basically, like they would get corn, and I guess, I don't know, like wheat or something like that, stuff to make bread at home, but it was like also a very limited amount of that. So they would still have to go, and because usually like they would get the bad part of the crop, so they would have to still go to the city. If they wanted to buy bread, they would still have to buy it. They were using the wheat to give to like animals or whatever if they were able to have any.
So and somebody had just said here, I have a good friend. She came to the U.S., fled a communist country. She lived in Czech Republic, and she's seeing what's happening here and what she fled from. Was with life under communism, and you still have family in Romania, right?
Yeah.
So was life under communism, under socialism? I mean, was life good in that way?
Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, the old people, like if I ask some of like people who didn't get to live through anything else but that, they would say, yeah, that was great, because like most of their life was through that, and now they're all of a sudden have so many options to make, and they don't know how to get out of that situation, so they're just kind of missing, but not necessarily that it was better, but maybe they just miss someone else maybe making the decisions for them.
So the people that had lived so long under communism, they were almost comfortable not having to make any decisions or
right, they were comfortable with like getting that little piece of bread that they were getting, because they didn't really have to put any thought into getting more. But I think the majority of people like now are trying to really get out of that, but I think the movement out of it is pretty slow even now after 30 years. Like most of my family who's still there, they say like, oh my God, I didn't think I would live again through something like this. So they definitely associate the COVID situation with what was back then. Because I think in Romania, like at the beginning, they had the military on the streets, like not letting them go anywhere unless they had like a piece of paper saying where they're going and stuff. I mean, it was still like kind of you handwrite it and you sign it, but
so I mean, it's like even though they're not part of communist Russia anymore, when with all with the COVID crisis, they kind of revert to what they know. They
feel it's like that, and they say they didn't think they would have to go through this again. Like, so they definitely associate the restrictions like with what was back then. I think the only difference maybe right now is that you have more access to information. Like back then, you weren't allowed to watch the news, or there was no news except for the dictator kind of having 2 hours of airtime every day saying how great the country was.
Do you think
Stuff
that
like
do you think
but-
that people knew that it wasn't as great as they were being told, that there were other ways of living like in the United States, or did they just not have any idea because there was no access to information?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think my parents went to like university, so I think they had through that, like there were certain like privileged groups like gymnasts and stuff like that who would go to university, and then they would be able to go outside of the country. So I think they were able to see that, oh, there's something out there, but they didn't have any idea how that was. And there's actually it's kind of a funny series on Amazon. It's called Comrade Detective. It's about communist Romania. They make fun of it, but it's really real. Like I watched it, and from whatever people say,
What's it called?
It was Comrade Detective, and it's kind of a parody. But if you were there, you would know that it was really like that. Like even your family could betray you. Like let's say you kind of got a hold of a newspaper from across the border, and you read that, oh, these countries are doing this and that. Like even your family could tell the Secret Service what happened, and you would be thrown to jail and stuff like that. So you really didn't have, you didn't have an option to buy stuff from outside. Like there was no import, export. I guess maybe export, there was some stuff, but like everything was self-reliant. Like that was the point, to make it kind of like an island of isolation and not getting. And in a way, I feel like I associate that with like the cancel culture nowadays, because it's like you can't discuss a different opinion, you're thrown to like Facebook jail.
Was it like that in Romania? Because Romania, I know, had some really cool history and a long history, with like Vlad the Impaler and a lot of the Crusades had taken, that was like the front line for a lot of the battles with the Turks and some of the Christian armies. And it did communism, and I know it was before your time, but were there restrictions on history, or like what kids could be taught? I mean, I know the communists ripped down statues and all that, but was history something that, like, especially the Romanian history, something that was allowed to be taught in Romania during communism? If I know it was a little before you.
I mean, I don't know. I think my brother will be able to tell me more about that, but they were definitely taught like, propaganda material about how great the USSR is, or like later on how great the dictator is. And they had to, like, I don't know. They couldn't even kids, they couldn't talk about anything else than how than what was available back then. So
you were telling, so you live in New Orleans, and I know that you've had a governor there who's been pretty aggressive in as far as closing businesses and restricting people's freedoms, closing bars. And I saw where they've been suing bar owners to get court orders to stop them and fine them and all that stuff.
yeah.
And you obviously live somewhere where before that there was a lot of freedom with what is it, Bourbon Street, and they put you guys all over the news. I remember is look, they're being irresponsible. Everybody else is staying at home and being safe and social distancing, and they're in New Orleans, they're out partying and they're going to be in big trouble and they're all going to die. So.
Yeah.
Your governor really kind of hammered down on that, and what kind of, what I was going to ask you is, whether you saw some similarity to Romania and what kind of what's going on in the U.S. But let me ask you first, what kind of experience was it in New Orleans as far as your governor's restrictions on how your life used to be there? Or Trey, you can answer that
Trey
too.
can answer. I only lived there for a year now, and I don't feel like I got to experience it all that much because, like, I think I moved in July last year, and then the restrictions started in March. I don't know. For me, it was really weird just because, okay, we're following some rules, right? But I think there's no background necessarily to that. Like they first shut down everything, then they reopened for 20%, and then people were able to sit outside, and then they came back and said, well, the people who were outside were spreading the virus, and then they shut them down again. And I don't know if they, like, that was really confusing. And if we're following, I read somewhere this thing that kind of like really resonated with me, that, you know, if those restrictions that are that strong, like, you have to be able to prove that the way we were approaching things before is not working. So in all cases, when situations like this have happened, they were saying, like, we should probably first protect the vulnerable people because that's what we've been doing in the past, and it's worked. Like, we're not imposing things without justifying them. And I think, like, that was weird to me that they didn't really justify. I mean, it didn't make sense. Like, people are outside and they're spreading this virus at a super high rate, you know, like, I don't know.
When it's come to find that the virus is spread indoors way more than anything to do with outside. So they're trying to backpedal that as well.
So Trey's a sometimes one of the street artists that you'll see in New Orleans, right? I mean, that's my word, not his. But he spends a lot of time outside around Bourbon Street and the restaurants and the bars. So let me ask you, what kind of changes did you see from, you know, what used to be the Big Easy to what it was like under, you know, your governor's new state of emergency rule?
Well, also a big reason why, I guess New Orleans got into hot water was everybody from around the country and globe were coming to New Orleans to party during the pandemic. And of course, they want you to come because they want the money. You know, New Orleans is purely a tourist area, and, you know, they sell a lot of art, they sell a lot of alcohol. But before that, you know, everybody comes and goes and drinks and eats whatever they want. And, you know, probably the most clean thing you'll ever find there is the COVID as far as disease goes. You know, they find flesh-eating viruses, all sorts of stuff that never makes the news. Plus, the crime was bad before the COVID, and now it's skyrocketing. And you don't hear a lot about the homicides, about anything, petty crime. And, you know, there's just not enough. There must be not enough budget allocated to deal with it for some reason, but yet they're still getting all this COVID money. And where's it going? That's what I kind of want to know. I don't know if that answered your question.
So sort of like the unintended consequence of their COVID restrictions caused not only businesses to go out of business or suffer, but crime, you know, to get even worse where it was bad before.
Not looting, but crime from families and neighborhoods and residents breaking into other neighborhoods and homes and stuff. If that makes sense.
Somebody had asked here, Deanna, what is with what you're seeing now in the United States with our reaction to COVID-19 and some of the things that they've done. Do you see any similarities with you know, life in communist Romania or even post-communist Romania? Mm-hmm. Any similarities?
Yeah, I think, well, for me, it was the testing situation. I think, I noticed in New Orleans, like, I got tested once. It was negative, by the way. But, like, they have all these, like, I guess, sites where you have to wait in line for hours and no one tells you how many tests they have left. And then if you know someone who works at a clinic, you can get it And it was just really weird to me because I feel like that's most of my life in Romania. It was basically who you know. And it was the same during communist time. Like if you knew someone who was working at the grocery store, maybe they would hold a bigger piece of meat for you, or like they would give you the bread through the back door or something like that.
Right. Under socialism, some animals are more equal than others.
Yeah.
Have you read George Orwell's Animal Farm?
No.
Well, you of all people should read it, because it's sort of a metaphor of communism, and it takes place on a farm.
Yeah.
And the animals all basically revolt against the farmer, and the pigs, being really the smartest of the farm animals, end up kind of taking the lead. And you see they have some rules, and the rules change over time. And eventually the rule basically becomes that, well, that none of the rules apply to the pigs. The pigs get everything. Everybody else, gets the scraps and lives under the rule of the pigs, because some animals are more equal than others. And even though George Orwell was a socialist himself, he really foresaw exactly what all this stuff was. But so, I mean, that, we're back, we're doing something here, it sounds like now, that kind of was commonplace in life under communism, where, some animals are more equal than others. Like if you know somebody, you might get what you want. If you're a member, if you have the right connections, if you're a member of the party. But for the peasants, you're left standing in line, and you get very little information or misinformation.
I mean, I think if anything, COVID just showed even more of the inequalities. But I don't know why I guess they're trying to pretend otherwise. But yeah, I think that was the biggest thing that kind of reminded me of of that. And I guess it's difficult for me to associate it, because then I like here it's just luckily, or if you can say luckily, I don't know, like it's just a mask that you're forced to wear. In Romania, again, it was the military. But I think it's just like the whole confusion and like putting rules on people without a particular justification for their well-being. So you're kind of taking away everything from people, because like we're just gonna run around like headless chicken, right? And following.
So in Romania, you do what you're told, right? And you may or may not be the best thing for you, and they don't care necessarily, and they don't tell you. But the point is that you do it.
Right. I mean, at least that's how it was during communism, I would think.
But you were telling me about it's according to your family still in Romania, like their response to COVID-19 was, I mean, they kind of reverted to their old ways, and they closed off the borders and started requiring papers of people and issued a stay at home order.
Yeah. Initially it was like you couldn't go back. So I mean, there was a lot of like really strange things that were happening. If you were outside, so I think one of the things that we were lucky here in the US, and why we trust this, is that like you feel like you will always be able to come back home. Like in Romania, you weren't allowed to even go back home to like be around your family, regardless of your status, whether you were sick or not.
Is that so? So there's a danger of you may not be able to come back home. And is that from out of the country, or just out of the city, or whatever
out of the country? Yeah. And then after a while, I think sometimes around June, they reopen, or they allow people to go back. And then it was a mandatory quarantine, in the sense that you would get police knocking on your door every other day randomly to see if you're at home.
So there was a mandatory quarantine in Romania, and the police would actually come to your door to check and make sure that you're there.
Even in villages and stuff. So yeah. And then, and I know this, I mean, it's really purely just story but I know from like family members who have had to go through that.
And what happens if the police come to make sure you're in your house and you're not
you
there?
can go to jail when they find you. I don't know for how long exactly, and there was a fine. Now I think they took that out. So my dad actually was telling me the other day, because my dad lives in Italy right now. So both parts of my family are in super like dangerous areas, I guess. But he's close to retirement, so he was kind of getting ready to move back home this year to take care of my grandma. And he was saying like, well, now they switched it to, if you go back home, you have to be in the hospital for this quarantine
So
thing. You can't even be at home. Like they put you in a hospital with like, regardless of whether you're sick or not, like you're in the hospital with other people who might be sick.
So, I mean, in Romania, as with much of Europe, leaving the country is kind of like us leaving the state of West Virginia, or you leaving the state of Louisiana. I mean, there's lots of travel in between countries, right?
Right. Exactly. It's like states here, like you can drive, but obviously, I mean.
But when you come back, they had a mandatory, if they let you back in Romania, to go home, even though you're a citizen there.
Yeah.
They had a mandatory quarantine where it wasn't you stay in your house. They put you in a hospital whether you want to or not.
Right.
In a Romanian hospital.
Yeah.
What are the hospitals like? I mean, are they just like Soviet era hospitals, or are they?
Yeah, I don't know. Like Trey saw some of the buildings there. I mean, it's like even Bucharest, I feel like, which is the capital, kind of still has a lot of the communist time buildings, which it was when most of like the buildings were built, or most of the cities and stuff like that, because that was one of the things they pride themselves with. Like, but yeah, they're pretty old school. Like imagine the what do you call that? The heater that with the water, with hot water.
Boiler.
It's like
radiator heating
thing. Yeah, and like shared rooms, and I think even if you're like, at least in my hometown, it was like you would only get in a special single room if you knew someone at the hospital, and plus. It's still like you have to pay the doctor basically to kind of give you attention and stuff like that. But I think like the worst thing that I was like, because here I think a lot of people say, oh, the EU took care of this so much better than the US, but like I hope I'm not getting in trouble with this, but
hopefully they don't send the secret police after your family.
But I feel like I still have that PTSD thing in my. But what happened was with Romania, they had the borders closed for everyone, but then somehow Germany and England signed this. I guess not treaty, but like something with the Romanian government to allow people from Romania to go and work the fields, like pick up crops from Germany and stuff. And they were, of course, all of these are like kind of EU sponsored programs. There are not like, or it's like private farms or whatever, but they were promising like PPEs and stuff, and then they brought people there and they were sharing rooms and no protection. And it was just like really weird because like, okay, you're locking all of the borders, but then you're still allowing this
did they have a
like,
mask requirement that you have to wear a mask in public in Romania?
Yeah, they do.
Do they still have that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you still can go to the store unless you have a handwritten paper saying that, oh, I'm going to the store. Which again, like I don't know what that does. But
so in Romania, you have to stay in your house. The police come and check to see if you're in your house, and if you want to go to the store or anywhere, you have to have basically a written permission slip to do it. And that's post-communist Romania.
Yeah. But I mean, I don't know how post-communist Romania really is, but yeah, that's happening
So
right now.
it sounds like one of the realities of decades of life under communism is that it's almost impossible to undo it. Like once you've had
Yeah.
entire generations of people living under, a life where you do what you're told, you get what you're given, unless you know the right people, and
Yeah.
it's hard to. I mean, you don't just go from that to a life of freedom and free enterprise.
I think the message is don't go there. Like, don't believe it. Because, like, even I have a lot of friends who are in bigger cities who are like traveled outside the country and like, see how it is outside of that. But I also surprisingly have friends who are like, when I posted about how surprising this was to me, and I was just asking, like, hey, is this read that police checking on you and stuff, and they were like, well, you should like see of your own business, is not that bad here, I mean, in their heads. And I mean, my mom tells me it's really bad that they're going through this again, and they have such strict regulations on what to do and not do. But on the other hand, other like young people are saying it's not that bad. And I think it's just because they don't understand how bad really it is to be limited in that way.
Right. If you've never really experienced, the freedom to make your own choices, then, you don't necessarily know what you're giving up.
Yeah.
Do you think that they've been, I mean, is there still some, well, I feel like there's been misinformation in this country as far as scaring people beyond the point at which they should, making them feel like it's worse than it really is in order to impose harsher restrictions or take greater control. Do you think it's, I mean, are they doing it the same way? Do you get like the EU news in Romania, or do they have like a Romanian news media?
Well, we are part of the European Union technically now since 2007. So yeah, we do get like outside news, but it's mostly like Romanian news is just like news here. It scares everyone. Every time they're making a big mountain out of an ants. Well, is that the same?
A big mountain out of an ant cell? That's great.
Yeah. I don't know if that's a US thing too, but like, yeah, it's I feel like media everywhere is like that, because if you're not sensational, you don't have viewers. So I don't know.
Yeah.
That's my opinion, I guess.
Well, I appreciate it, Deanna. That it's funny how people can argue for socialism, and they have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. They can't point to one country where it's actually worked well, and you can point to one country where it did operate and exist for a long time, and that was the Soviet Union. And Romania.
I think if you should talk to my brother about this, partly because he's like,
I'd like to.
He's lived through this much longer than me, but also he's studied history here he's like really into that about Romania too, but he's studied enough of the US history to know better the comparison.
Yeah, I'd like to talk to him about that sometime.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's similar that that's the same sort of Soviet style misinformation is taking place here, where they've presented things in such a way as to make people feel more scared than they should be. Of course, there's an actual threat there, but here you have an entire generation of millennials, or in whatever they call the 18 through 34 or so crowd now, who think that they are on the cusp of dying, if they go outside without a mask on. And it's crazy to think that just mere months ago, 6, 7, 8 months ago, if you would have asked somebody, are you going to go in a store with a mask on. I mean, they would have thought you were crazy. I mean, you can go in any hospital in the country 8 months ago, and you don't see nurses walking around with masks on or doctors walking around with masks on outside the operating room. I mean, I used to do, my father was an orthopedic surgeon, and I don't know how many different days as a kid, I sat at the nurse's station in the hospital and went on his rounds with him and checked on all his patients, almost all elderly people who were recovering from surgery. And I never once saw him with a mask on. And, we've had flu, we've had all sorts of stuff that, but nobody ever thought that it was necessary for healthy people to wear masks ever. And it did happen some during the 1918 epidemic, but, it's just such a change in our society. And the question is, what is the cost going to be? And that's where we get to the school reopening. And the other day, the governor of West Virginia instituted this school code system for the reopening of West Virginia schools. And he had kind of a rainbow code of when schools can open and when schools can't. And I mean, I honestly, I didn't listen to the whole thing. So I'm just kind of regurgitating what I've seen and what people have said in the news reports. But, it sounded like there was, all right, if you're in a red county, then we're going to do distance learning of some sort. You're going to have to learn on the internet. And then if it's not that bad per 100,000, then, we're going to have basically a fairly normal school operation. But, it can change. And then what happened? Like 2 days later, Vice President Pence comes and he meets with Governor Justice at the Greenbrier Resort. And I don't know what was said, but like the next day, he had to reevaluate what the hell he was doing and change it. And it sounds to me like the Trump administration sent Pence here and read Justice, the Riot Act, and said, why are you, this is my opinion, obviously, why are you acting like one of these Democrat governors who was trying to hurt Trump? For instance, the governor of Louisiana. Why are you, you're a Republican governor, right? Why are you taking the side of the socialist teachers unions? Why are you making things worse than they need to be when West Virginia has had very little problem? Appreciate that, Deanna. A couple people here said they appreciate you sharing your experience. So thanks. I'd like to talk to you more about it, especially your brother. But the school color code system then gets changed. So why do you announce it the day before you meet with the vice president and his people? Why not wait to see what input they have, if that's sort of the purpose? Unless you're just trying to impress them. But he puts this color code thing out first, then meets with them the next day, and then has to backtrack the day after that. Like, well, wait a minute. We may have, it may not, we've had to reevaluate some things. Well, it sounds to me like they sent somebody here to rein him in a little bit, to clip his wings a little bit. So I haven't exactly looked to see what all the reevaluation is, but this, it might have had something to do with the misinformation. Just look at the numbers that I presented. It has very little danger. It poses very little threat to anyone under the age of 55, 45, especially school-age children. Just very little threat. And so that means really, well, the greater threat is with teachers. But, are they to be a protected class, whereas the rest of, people at Walmart have been working, and, people at the hardware store have been working, and pretty much everybody who can has been working. So, there's always going to be some sort of safety threat in life. I mean, hell, you take your life in your hands every time you get in a car. And that you could die, that trip could be your last. So, but it's worth it to you to do it, to get to where you're going. And it's worth it, in fact, so much that you don't bother to wear a helmet or a 4-point harness when you do it. So you're always balancing safety versus freedom. But what will this whole thing cost our children? So they already got their school year last year cut early by the governor. He ordered the schools closed. So, what will this cost children? Let me point this out. The governor's order is what I meant to say. The governor's order specifically said that it includes private schools. So it's not just public schools, but he's including private schools, so that if there's too many coronavirus cases, it's over the threshold in his county, as he's set the threshold without the legislature's input, that he's going to make them stop school. He's going to close schools, and it's going to be distance only learning. Well, why close private schools when you don't really control any other aspect of the private schools? Well, here's the reason. Because the unions don't want competition. That's something they've lobbied for around the country is parents have already realized what a scam a lot of this stuff is, that their teachers unions are taking national positions in advocacy on abortion, on all sorts of things, political issues that have nothing to do with teaching kids or getting better pay for teachers or having better schools. It's just part of this leftist socialist agenda across the country. And that's something they've been lobbying for is, what's going to happen is people shouldn't get a choice. Kind of like in communist Romania. You don't get a choice. You get what the government gives you. If the second people have a choice, what are they going to do? They're going to pick the better choice. So if the public schools are being closed and the parents need to get back to work, they want their kids to start learning again, and they're willing to accept that risk, where are they going to send their kids? They're going to send their kids to a private school. But the public school unions don't want to allow that. The fact is that the public schools have been so clearly shown up during this coronavirus panic that the private schools have been targeted. And so they've included these private schools and these onerous government restrictions and burdens on the school reopenings. And that's to hide their incompetence, their embarrassment. They want to bring the private schools down to the public school level as closely as possible because they don't want competition. And at a certain point, they're, I believe, really restricting religious freedoms. There are private schools in West Virginia as elsewhere who are run by religious organizations, by churches. And that's part of their ministry is they teach kids and families that want to be a part of that religious instruction. And now they're being included in these color code sort of deals, and it may not even be applicable to them. I mean, they may have far fewer students already. They may be able to completely maintain social distancing and all the other guidelines that the rest of us, abide by, but they're being closed down anyways, because that's what government does. So, private schools could really flourish during this time because they can offer, and they've proven that they've been able to offer, safe learning, face-to-face learning that gets results. Or, you also have homeschooling groups. And it's in some parts of the country, apparently these have really been thriving. They've called them pandemic pods. So private schools really have a this is kind of a time in history where they can reach for the stars. They can shine. They can fill gaps that are currently there. They can fill voids left by the government public school system. But no, government's going to stop them from doing that because government does not like competition. So just remember that our governor here in West Virginia, who's supposedly a red state governor and one of the most conservative, God-fearing bases of voters anywhere in the country, that's who your governor is serving in this executive order, ignoring their legislators. That's who he's serving, this national teachers union agenda that fights for abortion and the restriction of private schools. That's what our governor did. So what was the cost and what will be the cost to children? Well, in one article I was reading, they expect that there's going to be a big lag in kids being able to graduate. There's going to be, at least 3 to 6 months of lag where kids are going to be behind where they should be. And kids are going to learn less. There's going to be a big jump in the dropout rate. And, who's this going to hurt as usual? Who's this going to hurt the most? I mean, the very people that are preaching to us about privilege and equality and inequality, well, they're the very people that are now hurting the underprivileged populations, the minorities, the Black, Hispanic schools that are already below par, where the education is already below par. Who's that going to hurt? In West Virginia, if the governor, and I don't believe he will, because I think he's doing a lot of pandering in this, but say he does close the schools again and he requires online distance learning. Well, doesn't that assume that those children all have the ability to do that and do that well? I mean, how many here in my office in rural West Virginia, I pay for, let's see, about $350 a month for 2 different internet service providers, because the internet is so unpredictable and so bad at times. It really just is. Some days our internet cuts in and out, and so I have the ability, I have the financial means to get both, and so I'll just switch over to the other one when one's screwing up. But there's going to be these kids in hollers everywhere, even in our county here, which is one of the more prosperous ones in the state. You have kids that I know that my wife was a teacher, and she had kids that had, I can remember her telling me about, no running water, just terrible home lives. And yeah, the government provides welfare, but that doesn't mean that the parents even take it or gives it to the kids. And believe me, with the CPS and stuff, they do, many of them do the best they can, but there's still not enough resources to fix every problem that's out there. The bar is very, very low for, to where the point at which the government steps in and takes kids and takes care of them. The bar is very low. Kids do not have equal access to learning in this way without going to school. And in West Virginia, although I'm advocating for the rights of private schools, if you read our founding documents, our Constitution, and I mean, it does anticipate a system of state-run government education. It just does. That is another part of the founding of our state. And government is supposed to be doing its job. And if it just says, oh, well, the teachers stay at home, the kids stay at home, and they meet over the internet, well, I mean, that might make do an emergency. But again, we're 5 months in, and at some point we're going to have to get back to living with the risk that always come with living. No child is guaranteed complete safety getting to school, whether their parents take them to school in a dangerous automobile or whether the bus driver takes them to school in a big dangerous automobile with no seatbelts, by the way. And there's been more than one bus crash that's happened in West Virginia. I can recall one where there was a drunk bus driver that drove off the side of a damn mountain with kids. And I think they were all right. But still, there is no guarantee in life of complete safety. And, the only people offering you complete safety, who is that? That's going to be the socialists. That's going to be the Nazis. That's going to be the Soviets. They're going to offer you complete safety, but they're not going to give you complete safety. They're only going to give themselves complete safety because some animals are more equal than others. And that's why I enjoy having these conversations with Deanna, because she knows that all this stuff is not true. She knows it's BS. I mean, she was just a kid, but her entire country just about lived under communism for so long, under socialism for so long, that they just about can't get past it. They don't know what it's like to be able to make their own choices, to live free. And here in America, our tradition, the whole point of our country is the exact opposite. It's not to bring everybody down to the same level, to the lowest common denominator. It's to allow the American dream for people to seek to thrive, to not just survive, but to thrive and to make money and to live a better life than their kids had. And that's been the history of our country. But even though most of the people in our state understand that and they value freedom and liberty, you have to remember that there are still groups there that oppose it. And that's why this private school provision was included in the school order, because that was the unions, the socialist run unions that were getting their way. Those are the same unions that shot down what's called the Tim Tebow bill in West Virginia, that sought to allow private school and homeschool kids who still their family pay the same taxes or possibly even more, that go to public education to fund the football teams and the baseball teams, to allow them to participate, because that's what Tim Tebow did. Tim Tebow was a great guy. He was from Florida like me, and his parents went to college with my father. My father was a quarterback at the University of Florida. And I believe he played football with Tim Tebow's father, or if he didn't play football with him, he was friends with him. And Tim Tebow's mother was a cheerleader there, and so he knew both of them. And they were deeply religious people, from my recollection. But they had a son, Tim, who they homeschooled, and he was a star student and a star athlete, and he was able to play football even though he was a homeschool student. And look where it brought him. He became possibly the most famous and successful college football player of all time. And he's a really good human being. And without the right for homeschool students who pay the same taxes to have their kids participate and get some of the same benefits, then the world would have lost out on that. So school choice and freedom and access to resources should be more available and widely available, and available to every student, not just those who fall under the control of the unions or of the government bureaucrats. And in fact, maybe we should go full circle. Anywhere around West Virginia, you see these little schoolhouses all over the place. Some of them are log cabins. Some of them are just small frame structures, but we had these little schools everywhere. And you know what? Maybe they weren't completely wrong back then. And I've looked at a lot of these old school textbooks from the 1800s in West Virginia, which a lot of them were from when we were Virginia. And you know what? These were not lackadaisical, half-assed schools. The education, I believe, in the 1800s, based on what I've found in my old house that I'm restoring and what I've found elsewhere locally, I believe that they were doing a great job of educating students, and that the kids were coming out highly educated. You look at now under this new woke education system that's being pushed here. They don't even have history classes anymore. They've turned history, which really should be, in my opinion, at least half of the damn school day. I mean, history is so important, in my opinion, and in reality, history is so important. And they've turned history because, as we heard Deanna say, history is bad when you're a socialist. You suppress history. There is no history. There's propaganda. You learn what the government tells you to. But history, true history, is important, essential for a free society, for a free people. And they learn so much history. And now it's down to like social studies. They don't even call it history, social studies. And that's where they teach you about socialism, I suppose. But if you look at the books that I've found just in my old house of what students were learning in the 1840s, 1830s, 1820s, 1870s, 1900, I mean, they had serious textbooks. I mean, they were reading the Federalist Papers, and one of the books, I mean, this kid was underlining all sorts of provisions in the Federalist Papers, and then he was writing on the backside of it which ones he agreed with and which ones he didn't agree with. We're talking about from the 1840s. I mean, what student right now, even in high schools, can tell us one provision in the Federalist Papers, or why he agrees with it, or why he doesn't agree with it? In fact, I think our kids now, a lot of them they're getting their information from tweets or Instagram posts of celebrities, of sports stars. I don't think they're being taught any history. You know, they're being taught very little history, and they're getting all this propaganda in from social media. Whether we as parents want it or not, it's getting through to them, and we're losing a lot of our history. So, maybe if we're not going to go, if we're going to have a new normal, maybe we go back to the system that our forefathers had here in West Virginia and elsewhere. We have these little schoolhouses. Every little neighborhood has one. You know, if in West Virginia, I believe we pay about $50,000 per student into the public education system. $50,000 per student. Now, it's probably not surprising, because that's what government does, is they spend money, and it never goes down in cost. It always goes up. But, all right, $50,000 per student. How about if they're going to close the schools? Fine. They give us each per student, they give us that $50,000 back. Now, let's say, all right, every 5 students, we go and hire some really, really good guy. We interview, or woman, we interview them, and we make sure that they're going to do a wonderful job teaching our students. And so that person that we agree to hire, like every 5 people, heck, we can do it in our houses, wherever. I mean, they're going to have a 6-figure income. We give them a 6-figure income. Our students get face-to-face attention. Only 5 students in their program, in their class. And it's going to be highly individualized, highly personalized, and it's going to be high quality. And the teacher is going to be making way more money than they would have under the public school system. Who is the loser in that scenario? I mean, what is even the downside? I mean, it sounds like maybe they knew what the hell they were doing in the 1800s and in the turn of the century, the early 1900s. I mean, maybe they weren't such, ignorant idiots after all. And maybe we go back to that. I mean, if we're going to have a new normal, let's rethink this whole thing. And regarding the misinformation regarding fear about the threat of COVID-19 to kids, you don't have to take my word for it. Even the study that we discussed, look at the words of the CDC director himself. And there was an article the other day, or maybe it was an interview. It was a Buck Institute webinar from July 14th. The Center for Disease Control director, Robert Redfield, he promoted the general idea of reopening schools, highlighting the low coronavirus risk for children without pre-existing conditions. He also noted that there was an unfortunate spike in suicides and drug overdoses, which he said are far greater in number than the COVID-linked deaths in the young. Isn't that exactly the truth? That now we are upending society for these kids, and instead of teaching them about the Federalist Papers or about how exceptional America is, or the ideas of freedom, as opposed to the ideas that Diana was born into in communism, and what the difference is, and why we are lucky. They're lucky to have been born here. They're being taught exactly the opposite. They're being taught a radical anti-American agenda in many respects. And I'm not saying that's happening around here, but in many areas of the country, I think there's evidence that it is. But back to my point here is that there's always going to be unintended consequences when government takes action. And here, there's very little risk, according to the science, for children. But what are the unintended consequences of completely changing their way of life, keeping them out of school, making them stay at home unless they have some essential task to accomplish, which I believe we're still under that order. And they have to wear a mask everywhere they go. I mean, what are the unintended consequences of that? I mean, suicide and overdose has always been a risk in young people. And the director of the CDC said, I'm of the point of view, and I weigh that equation that as an individual that he has 11 grandchildren, that the greater risk is actually to the nation to keep these schools closed. He said that over 7 million children get mental health services from their school. A lot of people get food and nutrition in schools, and added that schools are vital in terms of mandatory child abuse. And socialization is important. A lot of the learning takes place face-to-face, and that's the most effective method of teaching. I mean, of course it is. It's like as lawyers, we've had to try cases. I'm going to do one tomorrow. I'm going to try a civil case tomorrow over Skype. Now, how ridiculous is that? I mean, I've spent my whole career developing the skills to do this in a courtroom, where I can pick up an exhibit in my hands, and then I can show it to opposing counsel. I can say, Your Honor, may I approach the bench? And then I approach the bench, and I've done it 1,000 times. I walk up to the witness with a picture or whatever it is, a satellite view, Google Earth printout. I say, Mr. So-and-so, I'm showing you now what has been marked as plaintiff's exhibit number A. Do you recognize this document? And for the record, I'm the person seeing what I'm showing them. The prosecutor's seen it. The judge has seen his copy. We're all in the same room. I'm able to look the person in the eyes. He's looking at the map that I'm showing him. And I can, or for instance, I'm cross-examining somebody. It's a trial where we're questioning witnesses. And the person says something different than they said before. Well, before I could walk up to the person and I do the same deal. I'm showing you, the transcript from your deposition that you took on such and such day. Do you recall that? Yeah, you do. Okay. Well, you see, line number so-and-so. Yeah, you do. Okay. All right. Well, please read along silently as I read aloud. And then I read the person's words that show that they are completely full of shit, that they said something different 3 months ago. Now, how the hell do I do that over Skype in the same way? I mean, you just don't. You lose so much with the lack of the ability to look somebody in the eyes, to read their expressions, to deal with people. I mean, how weird is it? I mean, if I don't get to leave this desk anymore, I'm just questioning witnesses from sitting right where I am right now. It's going to have unintended consequences on us in many different ways. And it's going to be exponentially true for kids who are already so vulnerable to so many different influences. So the CDC director said that, their research showed that there were only 52 individuals that were under the age of 18 that had died of the coronavirus out of 218,000 that they looked at. So let's see. And out of those, only 35 were school age. Some of them younger than school age. And you know what? People drop dead every day anyways, and no one really knows exactly why. I mean, I grew up with people that had some sort of health issue that nobody knew. And I mean, say they were playing football and they just dropped dead. I mean, it happens. Did they die of playing football? No, they had some sort of underlying health issue. And so you never really know. There's always going to be awful things that happen. There's always going to be people that die. The point is, and it's not to make light of any deaths that there are, but we have to look at the real risk that exists. and the risk in school age children is nowhere near that of the flu. So we never counted deaths with the flu in anybody, much less school age children. We never closed down or change the way that they live or their school schedules as a result of the flu or any other deaths. And there's been suicides and car accidents and all sorts of things. The CDC director, going back to him, he said, so this is why I keep coming back for the overall social being of individuals. Let's all work together and find some common ground to get these schools open in a way that the people are comfortable and they're safe. And he also noted that some people may be better served if they have certain vulnerabilities to do homeschooling, and that they should have the access they need to the computer and to the internet to do that. So education should be the goal, face-to-face education, that is, 5 days a week. And that's straight from the CDC. So I've gone on enough about the issues here, but we're looking at two different things. One is there any constitutional basis for what these governors have done, and in particular the West Virginia governor, to enact new laws without the involvement of the legislature? Absolutely not. There's nothing in the Constitution that gives him any authority to do so. He cannot point to any statute to give him the ability to be both governor and legislature. It's unconstitutional. The West Virginia Supreme Court has already stopped the legislature from giving their powers away in the past. You can Google that, West Virginia Board of Pharmacy, unconstitutional delegation of legislative powers. So he's not allowed to do that. So there is no authority under the Constitution. The legislature, even if they did delegate the power to be dictator, could not do it. There's no going around the fact that the governor, if he feels that there's a public health, public safety crisis and that legislation needs to be enacted to respond to that, he has the sole option to call in the legislature, who are our representatives, who debate issues, and they vote on issues, and they're held accountable for their votes on those issues. We can complain to them, we can fire them, we can tar and feather them. Well, maybe we can't tar and feather them legally, but that's the process that was created for us. That is the basis of our republic. And so right now we have changed courses. We've decided on a new normal that's not a democratic republic. It has no basis in the system of government that was created by our founding fathers. And secondly, it appears through science that there's a great misinformation campaign being conducted, and that it's scared the hell out of people. And you have an entire generation of young people who are scared to death. They think that they face the same threat of death from COVID-19 as is faced by elderly people. And it's absolutely not true. It's exponentially different. The science shows that they face little to no threat. And you know what? Then the argument comes, well, they might take it home to grandma or grandpa. That's why we're doing it. Well, that's not what they're scared for their own death. That's what the polls show. But even if that is the fear, that we can also inadvertently bring it to our elderly family members. Well, the problem with that is, you know what? From day one, every American citizen, especially every West Virginian, has had the absolute right to choose to take any safety precaution that they want. They could have stayed in their basement bunker this entire time. They could have had a giant mask on their head this entire time. They didn't have to have any contact with anybody if they didn't want to. So any susceptible person, any vulnerable person had the choice to take whatever precautions they wanted to take. Never before have we said, okay, well, we're going to take healthy people and we're going to make them wear masks. We're going to make them stay in quarantine. I I mean, who would have ever thought that before? It's about quarantining sick people. It's about making sick people wear masks. I mean, who should be wearing masks? That's somebody who has COVID-19 and has symptoms and is coughing and sneezing and snotting everywhere. If they should stay quarantined or wear a mask, not healthy people, according to the way we used to think. So that's about everything that I wanted to go to. We've only been about 2 hours or so. There's a lot of questions. I haven't really looked at the questions. Let me look at them real quick. Just read that over 50% of the private schools won't open back up at all in the country. The number will get worse, not better. Well, that's probably true, because the private schools, especially in West Virginia, have a hard enough time competing as it is, because they actually have to come up with the money to pay their teachers. It's not anything that's guaranteed in any contract to be paid by the taxpayers. So, if they're not able to give face-to-face instruction, I mean, who the hell is going to be paying the same tuition? They're not going to pay it. And where are they going to get the money to pay their teachers? So, I mean, just like how many restaurants across the country have gone out of business forever as a result of these lockdown orders? A lot of them are never coming back. And, sadly, it's probably going to be the same way with a lot of private schools. When you have an uneducated population, you have more demanding government control. Well, S. Marshall Wilson, who's running for governor in West Virginia, and who I highly recommend that you look up his website. Again, Marshall Wilson, running for governor, and write him in if he can't get on the ballot. He was talking to me one time about third world economies. And, he had said, West Virginia's got a third world economy. And that's not to say anything bad about the people in West Virginia. That has to do with the government. That's how third world governments operate, is the government provides everything by purpose. The government, it all comes from the government. And you have a society that is purposefully trying to be made to be dependent on the government instead of being independent, and having more freedoms and taking new risks and making attempts to thrive. The opposite of that is government dependence. And that's what West Virginia has developed for many, many generations under Democrat rule. You can look at McDowell County, West Virginia, to see exactly what it's like to have a third world economy. You have decades and decades of government dependence. So at one time, there was more than 100,000 people down in McDowell County. And so the coal mines run dry, and the jobs are gone. And so you go from a booming city down there in Welch to, you had 100,000 people, and all of a sudden the jobs are gone. Well, over centuries of human civilization, what have people done when there was no opportunity where they lived? Is they went to where the opportunity was. And that's been the same way in the history of America. If your coal dries up, your economy dries up where you live, well, hell, you go somewhere else. You go where the opportunity is. And that has been the necessity of human existence. But the consequence of that is that people progress. They get better over time. They develop technology. They develop wealth. They develop new inventions. I mean, that's the American dream. We didn't just keep moving west because we liked the climate. It was we wanted more. We wanted more land, more opportunity, more money to have for our kids to have better lives and more assets than we did, more opportunities. And so you take McDowell County, West Virginia. What did they do? The government said, "Oh, well, we'll take care of it." Instead of allowing the people to go and find new jobs, new opportunities, let's just leave them right where they are and let's just feed them. Literally, let's feed them. And that's what the government did. And John F. Kennedy came in there to McDowell County in 1960 or early 60s, and they started the food stamp program in McDowell County, West Virginia. That was early 1960s. Now we can fast forward 60 years, almost 70 years. 60 years. Math was never my strong point. So fast forward 60 years of government feeding people instead of allowing the private economy to take its course as it's done elsewhere. And what are we left with? We're left with a county that has 8,000 or more abandoned buildings to be destroyed. Very sad. We're left with a county that has the worst life expectancy rate out of any county in the entire country. McDowell County, West Virginia. The poster child for government wealth. So the life expectancy of a male in McDowell County is only 63 years old. And it's a couple of years older than that from females. And that's awful. And it's that's the worst in the entire country. Their economy in McDowell County, West Virginia is off the charts, if not the worst in the entire country. And you can see that if you drive through there. And it's very sad what's happened. But that is the result of a third world economy. That's the result of a government taking care of people. They do an awful job. That's not what our society is founded on, is the government takes care of people, because that doesn't turn out well. And, I'm not sure what's worse, is that or communist Romania, where you wait in line for a piece of bread unless you know somebody. And doesn't West Virginia have a past like that of corruption, of knowing the right people? You can make a lot of money on some sort of government contract if you know the right person. You can get rich if you know the right person. You can do well politically if you know the right person. But the rest of you, you're just the peasants. And you'll take what you get. JFK had a lot to do with the Nanny State. Yeah, he did. Look it up. He went exactly to McDowell County, and I believe it was 1960, and he made a big deal about it. And in hindsight, he said nice things, and he said people, not every day is sunny, but the people of West Virginia are, or something like that. And people still love him for it. But you don't think that was bullshit? That's what politicians do. And where did it get the good people of McDowell County being taken care of in the context of a nanny state? It was an absolute disaster in every way. And I'm not running for any office preaching to you here. It just facts are facts. And that's the numbers. And here we have to get away from that. The path to prosperity is going to be liberty and freedom. That's been proven in history in every civilization that there's been, and government will never allow it. But that's been the course of things in West Virginia. Going on 60 years old now, grew up in West Virginia school system. Federalist Papers were barely touched on in U.S. history. Loved West Virginia history. Somewhere here, I've got a book. I have literally a textbook from 1900 that I found the other day, and the entire book is called West Virginia State Government and Civics. And it's like this thick, and it goes through the West Virginia Constitution. It breaks down every article, every section. It talks about how government works, how the counties in West Virginia are technically control themselves, and the state doesn't technically control the counties, but it does have to follow state laws, and how the House of Delegates introduces legislation and the Senate has to has to adopt it, then the governor has to sign it, and then how can a governor veto that? I mean, all these things were taught to kids. I mean, can you imagine that? And how important is that? And yet now they're, who knows what they spend all their time on. But if that's not important, I mean, that's the foundation of everything. I mean, we see what the result is when the law, the Constitution, the whole concept of freedom is completely ignored. We end up with many aspects of our society seeing no problem with being ruled under a dictatorship, which is exactly what's happening right now. They see no problem with it because, they feel he's done a pretty good job. The numbers have been good. They feel safe. Is that the only thing that matters? You feel safe, but what happens when, the guy you don't like wins the next time? And he can just declare a state of emergency for anything he thinks is a threat. All you have to say is an imminent threat to public health and safety, global warming, or the Montana's going to explode their giant volcano. And I mean, you could come up with any number of potential safety threats. And look, Governor Justice has gone 5 months now, 5 months with an imminent disaster area threat for every county in the state, many of whom it's never panned out. There's never been a disaster. So how do you get away with that? How is Monroe County a disaster zone after over 5 months without one death from COVID-19, but many deaths from heart disease and car accidents and whatnot? How do you justify keeping us in a state of emergency when we have more deaths from other causes? And why aren't those a state of emergency? Because the goal here is all about government doing what it does, government gathering more power on its own. And our founding fathers knew that would happen because it always has happened throughout history. In the 18th century, when our principles of government were developed, they really had sort of a revolution and thought about liberty and freedom. And that is the basis of our government, and that was enshrined in our state constitution as well. And now I'm sure it has nothing to do with the fact that they don't teach about government and freedom in schools, but we're a whole society now that at least half of us or so or more are completely okay with it. Many old school West Virginians believe that JFK was a saint. I know, because he said nice things and he did it in a nice way. And you know what? He was by all accounts a great man. And I mean, look how different he was than Nancy Pelosi or Joe Biden or Jerry Nadler or Chuck Schumer. I mean, what did he have in common with those guys? Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Would you ever hear that coming from the Democrat National Convention? Hell no, you wouldn't hear it. So, it was a different time, and he was a completely different person. And I'm not knocking him specifically, but I'm just saying that the idea that was born during his time, and it wasn't born then, but it was really advanced then, that government, had this obligation to take care of people, and that, we can fix poverty and we can fix unemployment. I mean, no, you can't. Government, we've had a war on poverty and it hasn't fixed one thing. We've had a war on drugs and it hasn't fixed one thing. We just look at the damn Constitution. That's what the government's supposed to do, nothing else. Okay. Federal government, you do the military, you watch the borders, you make sure that things are good between the states, and the state government, you do everything else, but you follow the rules and get out of the way, let people do their thing. So, see, any more questions? Federal tax dollars, giant payday. Do you wear a mask in public indoor places besides at work? No, I mean, I don't go to Walmart if I can help it. If it's somewhere that requires a mask, I mean, I don't go there. I mean, I don't get in people's faces anyways. I mean, I'm fine. I practice social distancing. I don't want to get in people's faces anyways. But no, I'm not. Generally, I don't. I have to wear a mask in court, or if I really just have to go in a store, like, I'll wear a mask. And I mean, I don't have any problem doing that. But for me, it's the fact that it's the mandate itself. It's the law itself. It's not actually, it has nothing to do with the inconvenience of wearing a mask. Yeah, I don't like wearing a mask, and I have a deviated septum myself, so I find it very uncomfortable. But it's not just the inconvenience. It's the principle of it. It's the fact that it was done in such a tyrannical way. It was imposed on me. I had no choice in it. And I can't even complain to my legislator because he didn't or she didn't have a part in it. Hey, Christian. Clay County is also bad right now. Well, bad with the restrictions or bad with the COVID-19? All right. So as someone pointed out there, this is the website for my buddy and client, Marshall Wilson. If you sympathize with a lot of things, the way I see things, that liberty and freedom is more important than a perception of safety, then this is your candidate. He's running as an independent. He's fighting to get on the ballot. But unless if in case he doesn't, you have to write his name in. And I think a lot of people are going to do it. And you can learn more information by going to his website, marshallforwestvirginia.com. But to make a long story short, you will have to write him in. Let's see. All right. So that's probably about enough for now, but I appreciate you guys watching. And I had to get all that COVID-19 stuff and governor tyranny out of my system. Then I can go back to some of the other cases I'm working on. Hit the trails again. Yeah, that's definitely what I need to do. But anyways, thanks for watching. And if you need to contact me, you can go check out my blog site, thecivilrightslawyer.com. And if you need to email me, the best way to do it is my office email, jhb@johnbryanlaw.com. All my emails go to the same place. I may or may not see a Facebook message. I still haven't figured out, why some of those go to one spot and some of them go to another, and sometimes they get drowned out. So that's the best way to contact me. Let's see, anything else? All right, that's about it. And we're still working on the next challenge to the governor's orders. And hopefully I'll be able to put a lot of time in this weekend to getting that knocked out. And until then, wear your masks, follow the king's edicts. Oh, and this one's pretty good. I made that one. If you see any disgruntled vets walking through your town, don't bother them about the masks. And until next time, I don't want to miss this one as well. Freedom is scary. Check out my Facebook, the new Facebook page I started, having just to do with some of these freedom issues. And we created a private group on there to discuss some of these things. If you're interested in joining it, go to, it's just called Freedom is Scary on Facebook. And there's a private group as well. So go like the page or follow the page, and then you can request to join the private group. And, we can share, memes like that. But until then, appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.